Everyone. Welcome to the Nam Center for Korean Studies Colloquium Series. I'm delighted to introduce to you Professor Cheehyung Kim, who happened to be an old friend of mine today. Professor Kim is an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. His research and teaching focus on socialism, labor, industrialism, everyday life, and urbanism in the context of North Korea and East Asia. He's the author of Heroes and Toilers, Work as Life in Postwar North Korea, 1953 to 1961, which was published by Columbia University Press. And he's also the editor of the journal Korean Studies. Today's talk is titled Machines of the Quotidian, Architecture and Technology in Post-War North Korea. And this is part of his second project on the history of urbanization in North Korea. Professor Kim's work is among the most exciting scholarship in North Korea, so I hope you enjoy his talk today. And please join me welcoming Professor Kim with the warmth that will match the sunshine in Hawaii. Thank you.
Aloha kako, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here at this amazing institution, this amazing center. The Asian Studies program is one of the oldest in the country. And there's a connection between the Asian Studies program at Michigan and the one at Hawaii. Some of the early founders of the Asian Studies program were from the University of Michigan. People like Glenn Page, political scientist Glenn Page, went to Hawaii and established the Korean Studies program there. Thank you all for coming out. You know, it's that part of the season where you have so much on your mind, so I really appreciate your time, and especially when the Wolverines are 10-0. Unbelievable. When I got here, Evan, I was looking outside the visage here. The first thing he pointed out was the stadium. Oh my, yes. So thank you so much. Yes. Can we play this sound? Thank you. It may take a few seconds, but we'll get it to work. But this is a 1966 piece by Kim Sun-nam. Kim Sun-nam is, thank you very much. Thank you so much for the, yeah, we'll just keep it going. So this is a 1966 piece by Kim Sun-nam. He is today one of the most celebrated composers in North Korea, and there's a revival of him in South Korea as well. He studied in Japan, and then in the 50s he studied in Moscow in the style of new modernist music in Russia at the time, studying with people who were subscribing to the style of Shostakovich and so on. So he came back and kind of created this style of merging modernist experimental sound with traditional Korean sound. So you can hear elements of pastoral Korean notes with atonal, non-major, non-minor kind of chords blending together. It's quite unique. So the reason I'm playing this because for this talk as well. And hopefully we can start to imagine North Korea as a very different place than the way it is imagined today. North Korea as part of the same modern global history that experienced the same global processes, especially as a post-colonial country. It's a fascinating piece. And to veer away from a little bit, just momentarily, from looking at North Korea from the lens of propaganda and militarism. Okay, thank you. Thank you. So the rockets, the bombings, the firing of missiles, yes, they are tremendously important and in how we understand the world. But at the same time, North Korea is much more than that as well. So when you land in Pyongyang, or when you start looking up Pyongyang, so these are some of the sites that you will see. So this is the famous statue at Mansudae Memorial. Oops. Okay, there we go. And flanking the statue are these enormous Korean War monuments. Yes, the famous Cheolima Tower on the eastern part of Taedong River. And of course, the famous Ryugyong Hotel, maybe the infamous Ryugyong Hotel. It's complete now. Well, the exterior is. So some parts are being used as hotel, but not the entire 100 stories. So it is open, and they did finish it with investment from PRC. And of course, the famous, if not gaudy, but just incredible People's Study House that's right at the center of Pyongyang. So these are some of the immediate things that come up and you encounter when you go to Pyongyang, these are my own photos when I visited in 2014. But when you turn around, Pyongyang looks like this. Pyongyang is full of apartments, residential apartments, full of 4 or 5 story tall housing, alleys, tight, small alleys. It is an urban place of 2.5, 3 million people. The city of Hamhung as well has this kind of landscape. Hamhung is is a city in the northeastern coast. It's a very flat city, and it's also filled with apartments, housing, low-rise 4 or 5 story apartments throughout the city. Oh, I put this up because I found an apartment complex that sells dangogi, sweet meat, dog meat, dangogi. Oh, just to be sure, we're looking at these 2 places here, Pyongyang here and Hamhung on the eastern coast. Anyhow, so a quick historical overview. In the post-war period, North Korea was a site of major international cooperation, especially from its states, brotherly socialist states from Eastern Europe. So USSR, Hungary, they were heavily involved in remaking Pyongyang. East Germany was influential in reviving the city of Hamhung. Romania was there. Czechoslovakia was there. Sinuiju, the city right here, was rebuilt with Chinese military support. Bulgaria was there. So as you can see, all the major urban centers in North Korea were revived, rebuilt with the cooperation of socialist states from Eastern Europe. Even Mongolia, the second socialist country in the world, becoming a socialist country in 1921, supported as well with food and cattle. So Pyongyang itself, if we may stay on that topic, the rebuilding of Pyongyang was the magnitude of utopian urbanism that had not been seen in Korea since 1396, when the new dynasty, the Yi dynasty, the Lee dynasty, Joseon, rebuilt the northern part of Seoul into a city based on the ritual hegemony of the monarch, based on the governance of society through ritual, and originally the central part of Seoul, Hansong, was built with this kind of ritualistic ideology in mind. Pyongyang was an expression of another kind of hegemonic authority, this time that of the worker, or the hegemonic notion of the worker. So the actual rebuilding began in 1951, and then in 1953, with the help of USSR, China, Poland, and Hungary, the full plan was devised. And the way it looks today is largely based on the 1953 plan. And the central Pyongyang that we know, with the monuments and the square, okay, where they do the military parade, that central area is surrounded by, to the south, Pyongyang. So this part is actually west of Taedong River. Taedong River in Pyongyang curves downward for about 8 kilometers, and that's the central part right here. And it's surrounded by the Pyongyang train station, to the Pyongyang Theater, all the way to Moranbong, Peony Flower Hill, Moranbong, that is connected by the famous Stalin Street, today Seungni Avenue. And then at the far west, the boundary is marked by the Potong Gate. And at the center is the Kim Il-sung Square. So this kind of landscape was created in 1953. Okay, so here's some early footages of this period. 1959, the People's Army Street. Already by the end of the 1950s, we see a somewhat urbanized look of Pyongyang. Much of the buildings are still standing today, although Pyongyang, especially East Pyongyang, is going through a major revitalization period. Here's a street of Stalin Street. Today, Seungni Gori, Stalin Street. So, by 1960, many parts of Pyongyang were urbanized, defined by 4 to 5 story residential housing. East Pyongyang, these apartments were built with the support of the Chinese military. Seoul, at this time, were undergoing a similar process, not at the same scale as North Korea, but by 1960, there were some definite apartment complexes being built, especially like the Mapo apartment complex that began construction in 1961, for example. Okay, Hamhung too was a major location of rebuilding, especially with the support of East Germany, and the support of East Germany helped Hamhung become the second largest city in North Korea, and it still is. And today it combines, the city of Hamhung also occupies the area of Hungnam. They used to be separate cities, but today they are one city. Hamhung and Hungnam are one urban metropolis. And Hamhung became the center of North Korea's chemical industry. So for example, the famous Vinalon factory is in Hamhung, and the fertilizer factory is also there as well. So by the end of the 1950s, these 1, 2, 3, 4, 4-story tall apartment buildings came to define the modern way of of living. Not everybody lived in these places. Probably the most elite were able to, were given these houses. But nevertheless, even in Hamhung, by the end of the 1950s, this kind of modernist apartment style housing came to define the landscape. East Germans also built these single freestanding houses a little bit outside in the suburbs, so-called suburbs of Hamhung as well. This is how the main street of Hamhung looks like today. Many of the buildings are still standing from the 1950s. This street used to be called Wilhelm Pieck Avenue when it was first built. Wilhelm Pieck is the first president of East Germany. And North Korea at this time named this street Wilhelm Pieck Avenue, as they named the most important avenue in Pyongyang, Stalin Street. But in the 1970s, North Korea began to change their names. So any kind of foreign-sounding name, beginning in the 1970s, which is the beginning of the Juche period, were replaced. So today, Wilhelm Pieck Avenue goes by the name Jeongseong Avenue, Jeongseong Gori. So when I was there, the guide, the North Korean guides are so knowledgeable and so good at talking. They can make conversation with anybody. But anyhow, she actually told me that the old name of this street was Pikkegori. She said the old name of this street was Pieck Avenue. Pieck Avenue. She said Pikkegori. And somebody asked, what does that mean? What does Pikkegori mean? And she said, I don't know. I don't know what that means. Of course, I knew what it meant, but I didn't have the heart to tell her that it was the name of the first president of East Germany. Anyhow, so when you drive through the streets of Hamhung, I almost saw many influences of modern East German architectural styles, including the famous Bauhaus style, the very modernist, functional modernist style that came out of Weimar, Germany. And many of the Bauhaus architects and urban planners joined the East German government and the planning agencies. So when I saw the House of Culture in Pyongyang, which was built in the late 1950s, I was like, this clearly has some modernist Bauhaus angle. So this is the original Bauhaus school, built in 1925, designed by Gropius. What is interesting, and this is something that must be recognized, is that Bauhaus came out from the logic of capitalist industrial efficiency with the notion of form following function. And of course, socialist modernity has this root as well, the root of capitalist efficiency and with the aim of increasing industrial production. Okay, so in North Korea's housing or urban planning, the most fundamental unit is the 소구역, or micro district, based on a unit of 5,000 people, and it has school, daycare, and it must be in a walking distance to your job with a green space as well. So that was a fundamental basic unit of work. So what is important here is that the work unit, the work area, and the living area were not separated, and they were to be in very close proximity. This style, there was a lot of debate about this style because, of course, being close to a factory has many health, environmental consequences. So there was a lot of debate, but once the Soviet Union adopted this style, a country like North Korea too saw it as a path of progress, a path of modernity. So here's the first micro district built was the number 85 in West Pyongyang on the banks of Potong River, built in 1960. Here's a shot of that plan. And many of the apartments are still standing today. This green space right here is where the Ryugyong Hotel is today. So Ryugyong Hotel was built in the first planned housing area of Pyongyang. Ryugyong, by the way, is an ancient name for Pyongyang. So Ryugyong basically means a city with willow trees, many willow trees. And that was one old ancient name of calling Pyongyang, the city of Pyongyang. Is this mic on? Yeah? Okay. So a central regulative process within the whole process, the procedure of urbanization was the concept of efficiency. Of course, efficiency is a fundamental concept that comes out of capitalism and capitalist productivity. And of course, the notion that the state can change the productivity of the population through efficiency is also a very modern capitalist ideology as well. So part of a definite state hegemonic ideology that became universal is this notion that the state is capable of knowing about the population and able to change the productivity of the population through things like efficiency. And one important method within efficiency was this technique of prefabrication. This all sounds a little mundane, but when you read newspapers from the 1950s and 60s in North Korea, you read so much about prefab housing, prefab construction. The whole concept was, in fact, celebrated in North Korea, places like North Korea. 조립식 방법, prefab houses. And within this whole prefab technology, one particular technique was more celebrated than others and became famous. And this is the 통방 panel technology, one-room panel. So they were basically blocks. They were blocks with a hollow center. And these panels were stacked on top of each other, and that became the fundamental unit of a building. So the notion of one apartment being assembled in every 14 minutes came from this technology, from this building boom that happened in late 1950s in Pyongyang, when they would build entire structures with these panels, hollow panels. And it was possible to build them in matter of minutes, because in fact all you had to do was stack them on top of each other. Now, of course, so much about a living residential housing is about the interior, and the interior, North Korea also admits even in newspapers that they had a lot of problems. So the building exterior was complete, but the interior, things like plumbing, electricity, kitchens, bedrooms, paintings, and walls would take much, much longer, and very often never finished. So the housing boom in the 1950s, the construction boom, had two different sides. So this amazing speed based on prefabricated parts, including the one-room panel, but then, of course, the actual completion of the interior as a livable quarter, that was a different story. And North Korea always kind of suffered from this this dual problem. So what we're looking at is basically two broad categories of architecture. One, monumental, is a form that explicitly symbolizes the messages of hegemonic entity. So the Grand People's Study House is an example here. I'm going to talk about this building a little bit more. And the other form is vernacular architecture. So these are structures mainly built for the people's livelihood, including mass housing, schools, workplaces, and even entire neighborhoods. And we don't need to get too deeply into this, but some of my claims is that both monumental and vernacular architectural forms, they each embody both utopian and utilitarian elements. So what is ideal and what is instrumental? These are not tied to one architectural forms, but present in both. So a monumental architecture, for example, as a symbol of utopian vision, also held utilitarian purpose as well. Especially the utilitarian purpose of including the population under its bureaucratic order. State power in many ways, or state hegemony in many ways, is realized through bureaucracy. Yes, the police, coercion, force, it's all there. But the most essential part of state power is bureaucracy, which are everyday forms of power. So even the most monumental architectural form embodies this element. The utopian vision, maybe at the surface, but also the bureaucratic vision that can include the entire population within that vision as well. So this multiplicity of meaning, they are part of a transnational influence or process of bureaucratic and industrial developmentalism. And North Korea's architecture exhibit this dual transnational force that is happening throughout the world, especially in post-colonial areas. The expansion of state bureaucracy, which is state hegemony, but hegemony always works through bureaucracy. And then, of course, industrialization, industrial expansion as well. So seen from this angle, for me, North Korea's architectural development is a marker of state socialism as part of the 20th century, part of the same global process. So not an exceptional moment, but there are exceptional architectural constructions, of course. Not an exceptional moment, but a constituent of a globalized capitalist modernity. Okay, but let me stay on the monumental side for a minute, because it's actually very complicated. So the original plan of Pyongyang, the heart of the city, and at the center of this heart of the city was not a house of rule, was not a government building, but a house of learning. 노동궁전, right here, Kim Il-sung Square. And right behind the Kim Il-sung Square was the Workers' Palace, which essentially is a big, gigantic library. Not a party office, not a building for the cabinet or ministries, but a library. So this is still true, guys. So when the place where they do the famous military parades in Pyongyang. They're essentially, and the shots of all the military leaders and Kim Jong-un and his, right? His military personnel, they're actually watching this from the library. They rebuilt it, so they have a gigantic podium, right, where they can go up there. But they are essentially on the grounds of the People's Library, which today is called the Grand People's Study House. So that's at the heart of the monumental architectural planning of Pyongyang. So this is how it looks today. It's from the back. But from the front, you see the expanse of the Kim Il-sung Square. So monumental architecture, which represents state hegemonic power and the power of bureaucracy, does not always work in kind of a subjugating or kind of intimidating way, but it works through the building of a library, where it symbolizes, of course, right, the learning of in a new era of the working class, but also at the same time bringing entire classes of people within this framework of state bureaucracy as well. This central area of Pyongyang has some of the most famous architectural constructions of Pyongyang. So right just to the north of this area is the Mangyongdae School Children's Palace. It's basically a study hall with a science center, learning center, and if you are part of the upper class, middle upper class in Pyongyang, you would send your kids to this place after school. So all these places, the People's Study House and the Children's Palace, these are areas where kids go after their normal school for their extracurricular activities. So if we were in Pyongyang, this is where we'd be sending our kids for their after-school program. So kids who are talented in playing the instrument or in sports, they would develop their skills at these places. So in Western media, however, this kind of after-school program, it basically is a very grand after-school program, has a very distorted image, right? So all we see are kind of highly mechanical North Korean children playing their guitar and accordions in uniformity, right? In front of audiences, little kids playing the violin at a virtuoso level in almost kind of a freakish kind of style. We all have seen these scenes. So that's all we know, okay? That's all we know about these places. But they're basically after-school institutions where the best, the brightest, most talented kids are sent to train and hone their skill in a very North Korean kind of way. Oh, the Cheongyu관 is in this area as well. It's a restaurant that can seat maybe 2,000-3,000 people, famous for their naengmyeon, cold noodle, and dangogi, and dog meat. Naengmyeon and dangogi. All right. The famous Goryeo Hotel, the Twin Tower Goryeo Hotel, of course, is in this area. I'm just pointing this out because this area is an emblematic area of North Korea. Oh, the skating rink, a very futuristic style, the skating rink. And when I had an opportunity to give a presentation, a different kind of presentation about architecture at the Goryeo Hakhae. It's an association, academic association, where North Korean scholars participate. And I actually had very little knowledge about this place. I just knew that it was a very futuristic design. And our North Korean colleagues told me later that the myth surrounding this design is that it was designed after a winter cap with a palm at the top, and that it was Kim Il-sung's idea that the ice rink should be designed to represent winter. So this is supposed to be a winter cap, and this is the famous ice rink. Anyhow, oh, and Changgwangwon, the water park, amazing water park with the swimming pool right here, and this round thing is a bathhouse. Is one of the largest bathhouses in the world. A few thousand people can take a bath at the same time. Yes, and North Korea is very proud of its bathhouses. So I think I should write a chapter about North Korea's bathhouses and the various architectural forms of bathhouses. Okay, so let's move on to the second part, the part about technology. So this is something that I'm just beginning to explore and start thinking about. So you will have to indulge me a little bit. So in 1958, August 15th, Nodong Shinmun, this is the main newspaper of the Korean Workers' Party, the most important newspaper in North Korea, devoted the whole issue to the tractor. This is the front page. This is the front page of Rodong Shinmun, the Workers' Daily, with the Cheollima tractor, a photo of the tractor in the top right corner, and the main headline. The main headline celebrates the production of the Cheollima tractor. Guys, usually the headline is dedicated to some of the major events within the party, a speech by Kim Il-sung or other leadership, or a visit by a famous dignitary from the Soviet Union or PRC. Not a tractor. Not a tractor. But this tractor, yes. North Korea on this day celebrated the birth of its Cheollima tractor. Let me just move on to show just some other samples. And throughout the 1950s and 1960s, almost every newspaper issue dedicated an article to some of the new machine technology that was being developed. And these were all machines that were mainly for mass consumption and for mass use. The swallow bird bicycle, Jebi bicycle. It's a good-looking bicycle. I'd buy this bicycle. It kind of looks like the Dutch bicycle. You know what I mean? With the straight bar, right? With the comfortable handlebars. Yes, the three-wheeled car. The three-wheeled car. North Korea was not making their own four-wheel sedans at this time. Later, it would, with the cooperation of the Unification Church, the Moonies, the so-called Moonies, but we should not call them the Moonies. The Unification Church, they were the first investors into the automobile manufacturing in North Korea. But anyhow, the first so-called automobile was the three-wheeled car. And I calculated this. It would get about 40 miles per gallon. Not bad, 40 miles per gallon. The motorcycle, also called Cheolliho, Cheollima. Cheollima is a name that refers to a horse, a mythical horse. They can travel about 1,000 li a day. 1,000 li a day is about 300 miles a day. It's a horse that can travel 300 miles a day. And that's an amazing horse. So a real horse, a good trained, well-trained horse today can travel about 100 miles a day. That's like the maximum. of a horse's capacity to travel. So Cheollima is an exceptional horse. So the automobile, the motorcycle, also celebrated, also given the name Cheollima. Yes, and the tractor, with its birth in November of 1958. It had a top speed of 25 kilometers per hour. It was made at the Cheehyung factory in South Pyongan province, near Pyongyang, near the city of Pyongyang. And they say it was built for narrow and hilly terrains, ideal for North Korea. And here's a photo of Kim Il-sung visiting the factory. By the way, that's Park Jong-ae, by the way, a member of the Central Committee of the Korean Workers' Party and one of the most important women politicians in North Korean history. She is someone who remained on the scene for 50 years, and amazing person, and of course, highly favored by Kim Il-sung. So I knew that the Cheollima tractor was famous. So when I was in North Korea, I was trying to spot. And when I was touring a collective farm, a cooperative, 협동 조합, I saw one. And I ran over there and I took some photos. And my fellow, tourists, they were wondering why I was so excited about an old beaten tractor. It was still that red color that it was famous for. It also appears in many paintings, guys. The red tractor appears in many paintings. And it still looked like the old version with the round headlights, the skinny wheels. I was very excited. And it's actually a fully contained tractor. So it is functional in the winter times as well. So let me just go on to the part of trying to formulate a critique of machines. So Marxism here is once again useful for me. This requires us to place and define state socialism as a state-mediated capitalist system defined by primacy of labor, where industrial labor, factory work becomes the defining quality of human life. Surplus production is controlled by the state. So surplus is still essential. Surplus production is an essential part of this system. And of course, proletarianization of the masses, especially the farmers, into the working class. So redefining state socialism as a variation of global capitalism is an essential part of my research. And within this framework, Marxism becomes useful in the critique of state socialism. So I am using Marx to criticize a system that was based on Marx. And of course, it also tells me that state socialist countries never fully became socialist, although culturally we can say it was distinct from capitalist cultures. However, the system of labor was very much the same industrial capitalist system. And that's what it's all about. That's what it's all about. Socialism, if it can be anything distinct or different as an alternative to the capitalist system, has to create a new labor system. And of course, historically, state socialism never managed to do that. And it had to rely on the capitalist production system. Okay, so Marx himself, okay, let's indulge me for a moment here. Marx was very wary of machines because he noticed that machines actually prolonged the workday. Machines, with its ideology of shortening work, reducing the intensity, making the work easier, had a very opposite effect in reality. That workers were induced to work more because of machines. And Marx saw this as a kind of a perplexing problem in modern industrial system. Okay. And Marx was very different from Lenin. Lenin, of course, many people admire him for his revolutionary tactics, including myself. But he had a very complicated relationship with labor. And it was Lenin who actually envisioned the whole society working as a single factory, where labor becomes both joy and duty of mankind, which is also very much related to the notions of work laid out by people like Adam Smith, but also coming from the ethics of capitalism in places like in Northern Europe. So Lenin's view of work was very different from Marx's view of work. Marx, in many ways, thought that a revolution needs to also emancipate the people from labor. That labor cannot be the defining identity of the people. So, machines. These are some important passages that Marx wrote in the 1950s about machines. And today, this part is a very important part of the very large Marxist body. It comes from the rather short collection from Grundrisse. He wrote this piece called Grundrisse in 1955, 1958. And these are short notes, collections on the working process and the revolution and so on. And this is the most clearly defined section in Marx's thought about machines. And it's highly interesting. So for Marx, machines had a clear ideological side. So on the surface, they were supposed to make workers' life easier, less strenuous. But in reality, what it was doing was subsuming living labor or human labor within the machine. And in that process, essentially, machines were creating a new means of production of the workers. So within machinery, the workers were, in real life, becoming part of the production process as fixed capital. So he calls machines as a process by which human labor becomes fixed capital. So this is an essential point. So for Marx, human labor becomes capital not only through the market, not only by selling itself in the free market or as part of exchange value in the product, but also within the production process itself. So this is a very powerful notion within Marxism as well. So we commonly know that capitalism transforms human labor into a commodity in the end, of course, right? Commodity in two forms. The person as really as commodity in the open labor market, but also within the product, the labor being transferred into the product. But Marx also is pointing out a third way, that within the labor process itself, machines actually enable human labor to become what is called fixed capital directly directly within the process, human labor is already becoming capital. Anyhow, it's something that I'm dealing with myself too. It's a very complicated part of his theory. So apartments and tractors to end. Yes, apartments and tractors made work more efficient and easier. And apartments and tractors were surely measurement of material reality of progress, the new workers' world built with revolution. And they also represented state power, state hegemony, bureaucratic order, and of course, national pride. We can never reduce national pride, always important. But as part of industrial expansion, apartments and tractors are machines that can directly change labor. As machines, apartments and tractors further bring labor within the production process. And within this process, living labor of people collapses into the means of labor. And this is a very crucial point here. Knowledge, skills, the experience of the individual worker, these are absorbed as means of labor, as means of production, and of course as fixed capital, and thus a point of exploitation. Machines are in sum instruments of intensifying labor and of increasing exploitation. That's a very dark way of looking at these celebrated items, apartments, and the incredibly cute Charlima tractor number 1. And I want to end by saying that this is not the final point, however, because everyday life always prevails within this system, transcending state and capital's domination in the last instance. So there is a system, there is a production process within the industrial code, and this system is capable of bringing everything into it and eventually turning it into capital. But in reality, of course, it never works this way. It's always a partial process. And of course, in my first book, this is something that I focused on as well. The workers are always uncooperative. They're lazy, they're late, they take long smoke breaks, they complain, they fight with each other. To me, all these activities are signs of small everyday resistance, resistance toward being subsumed under the production system. I love this photo. I took it myself too, and it has this emblematic things about North Korea's modernity: the tram, the apartment, the electricity, right, and the people and the workers all within it, and somehow the people seem alive to me in this picture. That the people, they kind of know what they're doing. They're part of the system, but at the same time, they are always beyond it too. Thank you very much. I'll end here.
Thank you. I really enjoyed seeing a lot of photos, and I was really struck by the similarity between some of the photos that you showed us and the kind of scenes that I saw in East Berlin and Dresden.
Yes.
Like, the Wilhelm Pick Avenue looks totally like the main Avenue from Alexanderplatz.
You must have been to these places.
Okay, yes. Yeah, so to the east and,
Yes.
and also the, what you compared with the Bauhaus.
Yes.
That totally looks like the Culture Palace of Dresden. If you don't know that building, you might want to look it up. It totally looks like that.
Culture Palace of Dresden. Okay.
Dresden, yes.
Yeah.
So Dresden Philharmonic is currently stationed there. So it totally looks like that. So I really appreciate it.
Really?
Yeah. My question
Make
is,
that connection.
though, about something a little bit more boring. So I really appreciate, how you use these, modern architectural, buildings and technologies as a lens through which to look at and critique kind of capitalist production under state socialism. And I wonder if we can also use that as a lens through which to look at and critique the governance of citizenship in North Korea and situate it in a more sort of a comparative context. And I'm just asking this question because of small little things that I know about the Soviet Union. I have a student who sort of works on housing in the Soviet Union and contemporary Russia. And my understanding is that the kind of sort of provision of a mass housing that was sort of celebrated in the same way wasn't necessarily available to all urban residents, although certainly it was sort of celebrated as a part of the social citizenship that the Soviet citizens should be able to claim, but there was always a long queue. And also it was very important in making a distinction between an urban and rural citizens, based on, this propiska and, household registration and things like that. So I wonder if you also would see the kind of same processes that unfolded in the same period in North Korea, and because that would be also kind of part of this transnational, global process that you're looking at, construction of a citizenship and governance of a citizenship under state socialism.
Yeah, thank you. Sammy, should I respond? Yeah, thanks so much, Cheehyung. Of course, I mean, as far as citizenship is concerned, I've learned so much from your own book, your extraordinary book. North Korea citizenship is something that I have thought about at a pretty superficial level. It's fascinating to me. So 50s and 60s, during the process of proletarianization, which involved a radical form of affirmative action. I call it radical form of affirmative action because it was extremely violent in many ways. It reversed the class structure and created its own class structure, later to be called the Songbun system. But its basis is affirmative action, where the most underprivileged classes now become, through state force, become the ruling class. And this is not an easy process. And this has affected all levels of entitlement options for citizenship. And in many ways, this kind of class identity in North Korea defines citizenship itself. And in many ways, becoming more permanent in a way. So if you belonged to the revolutionary class, the poor farmers, the soldiers, and the partisans, especially if you fought along with Kim Il-sung, you become the ruling class with enormous privileges. School, housing, especially housing. So we can say that Pyongyang is for elite members of North Korea, for about 2 million elite upper class people of North Korea enjoying the privileges of the city. Okay, so that is true. So citizenship works, has a very strong class identity in North Korea. And Pyongyang itself has become an elite city. It is also a very troubling modern transnational global phenomenon as well. How entire cities become identified with a certain class. This happened in the Soviet Union, this happened in East Germany, and this happened, of course, in South Korea. Seoul today is a city that only the elites can live. The upper middle class can. It's an amazing city of 20 million people. But the people who can actually buy a place to permanently live within Seoul, it's a very small number. It's a fraction of the people who actually work there. So we see the same process happening in North Korea as it happened in South Korea. But of course, in South Korea, the old class structure was maintained. Whereas in North Korea, although it was a very violent process, there was an inversion of the class structure. So in many ways, North Korea exhibits the realization of an ideal that we have in this country. How we want to empower the underprivileged people. How we always seek to empower and share the entitlements with the underrepresented people. I come from a state where Native Hawaiians still very much suffer within the normal mainstream economy. But North Korea is a place where they actually accomplished wholeheartedly a radical inversion of the class structure. It has both tragic and ideal elements that I think we can learn from. But citizenship is at the heart of this matter too. Citizenship that is always tied to the class structure. Thanks for the question.
Yes, so I have a virtual question from an anonymous attendee. They want to say thank you for the wonderful presentation. I would appreciate it if you could please comment on the technical development of tractors in North Korea in the 1950s and 60s in relation to that in China and the US. This will help me better appreciate the significance of North Korea's emblematic presentation of tractors in your talk.
Yes. Thank you very much for that question. That is something that I'm also learning these days too, the actual technical aspects. But what I'm finding out is that North Korea was in many ways assembling these machines in North Korea, not building them from bottom up. So they were importing these parts from the Soviet Union, mainly from the Soviet Union and from Eastern Europe. China still at this time was very poor industrially. So Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, they were importing these parts and assembling them within North Korea. So that motorcycle that I showed you, it kind of looks like an old Soviet military motorcycle with it's a swift handlebar and very low. And the tractor itself, the tractor resembles tractors that were used in East Germany too. So what is important is that North Korea was bringing these parts and for the first time assembling them within the country with their own hands. So assembling itself became a celebrated domestic activity. Not inventing them, but assembling them. But hey, you know what? Hyundai Motors, when they started, what they did was they brought parts from Japan and the United States and assembled them in South Korea. That's how some of the early cars were made, right? I mean, in many countries, you don't make the actual parts, you just assemble. Maybe with a twist of the design. And that's what North Korea did too. So technically, it's the assembling that becomes a marker of birth of a new machine.
Could I? Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks very much for the talk. It was very thought-provoking and enjoyable. I just have I guess it's less of a question than it is kind of just trying to connect these two ideas of the apartment and the tractor. And I was thinking early in your presentation, you mentioned urbanization. You had a photo of Pyongyang and you said by the 1960s, Pyongyang was highly urbanized. And I was just thinking about that term in connection to, and I'm kind of riding off of some of Andre Schmidt's recent work in this regard, but in connection to mobility and migration, right? Because the idea is of a movement, when you mention urbanization, that there is some population movement that maybe is happening in a way that we can't exactly track, but it's moving from rural to urban, right? And the place of apartments within that, in your presentation, is a little bit contradictory. Like on the one hand, it's supposed to be functional and utopian, and it's gonna accommodate a different class of people. But on the other hand, as you mentioned, they kind of participate in fixing people in place and
Yes.
fixing a particular class in place as well, an already elite class that has
Yes.
access. But the kind of space of the Soguyok does that, right? Is a fixing in place, is a kind of confining.
Excellent point.
So, but it's interesting that the apartment, your utopian idea of the apartment, is supposed to be kind of, whether or not it's a fixing in place, it's an accommodation of a displaced class. And then second, the tractor is something that is supposed to kind of either make up for this movement from rural to urban or also accelerate it, right? It's something that's happening in the rural. And so there's an interesting connection between the two figures of the apartment and the tractor that I think you could maybe sort of explore through this idea of mobility, or this dialectic of mobility and confinement, which is
Certainly.
a central dialectic in any imagination of North and South Korea, right?
Yes, yes.
Ideologically. But then finally, like, these are, as you say, vernacular or quotidian or functional, the idea, even utopian kind of technologies, right? But in your presentation, you gesture towards that, but then you also ultimately end up kind of ending on the side of they're not utopian, they're ideological, or they're subjugating somehow. And so that was like a contradiction that I felt throughout. And so I don't really exactly have a question, but maybe you could speak to the problem of tracking mobility in an attempt to understand urbanization and attempts to accommodate new populations.
Yes. Thank you, Thomas. And of course, I'm talking to a North Korea expert here. I mean, there is a historical change that happens where urbanization in the 50s and early 60s does involve bringing masses of people from the rural to the center. But by the mid-1970s, it stops. What is interesting is that North Korea, I didn't mention this, but North Korea does not want to build megacities like Seoul. North Korea thinks megacities are a very egregious byproduct of capitalism. But of course, I mean, they're not removed from capitalism itself. So within this policy, North Korea's vision is to build many medium-sized cities. And Pyongyang becomes pretty much settled by the mid-1970s. Mobility becomes extremely hard. So in this respect, the urban and the rural technology and the technology of the tractor, and these are somewhat different. So North Korea tries to have this dual trajectory where urbanization is happening, but also the rural population needs to become modernized as well. And it's a highly uneven process, highly uneven. So some parts of North Korea, even today, they're using the ox to till the land, even today. So this cooperative farm that I visited, where I saw this, they had one tractor. That was the only tractor for the entire collective farm. So we know that it was a highly uneven process, of course. And I will have to explore this area where mobility is a momentary kind of a phenomenon.
Would it be okay
Yeah.
if I hijack one of the last question? Okay. Well, I was very intrigued by how you talk about monumental architecture and vernacular architecture side by side, and locating both utopian and utilitarian ideals. For that, I want to go back to the Putong River area.
Yeah.
Because so interesting that it was a place where first micro-district Sokuyok was built,
Yes.
but also the most monumental architecture of Yugyong Hotel of
Yeah.
the 1980s, right? And I
Yeah.
couldn't find anything about the decision process as to why Yugyong Hotel was built in that area. So I was wondering if you know anything about it and what your take is on that area. Because some people, some outside observers, suspected that maybe the development of the area is going back to the 1953 Kim Jong-il's master plan, which was mostly based on the model of linear city, as you just said, kind of reaction against the capital city of the 19th century. But that model became quickly abandoned in the subsequent years as the monumental architecture really gets concentrated along the Taedong River bank area,
Yeah.
where you saw all, the monumental architectures of study halls and so forth. So people thought maybe Ryugyong Hotel was symbolized going back to the 1953 model of the linear city. But when you look at the more recent development, like 미래과학거리, right, the future science road, it's not that area. So I wonder
not that
what
area.
the significance of Putong River is. And since you touched upon this idea of utilitarian, utopian coexisting,
Yeah.
how you would interpret that space.
Yeah.
That'd be really interesting.
Sammy, thank you. Thanks for the question. That's a hard one. That's a hard one. This area, Potong River. There are two major rivers in the city that run through Pyongyang. Potong River runs from east to west, but in the middle it curves downward. So that's the central part. And then there's also a smaller river called Potong River that comes from the north and enters the middle part of Pyongyang. And that's where the first urban residential area was built, this area. The Ryugyong Hotel, the beginning of the hotel was in the early 1990s, maybe started in the late 1980s. So this was Kim Jong-il's big vision. Kim Il-sung was all about industrialization and production and factories, restarting the factories and rebuilding its industrial infrastructure. Kim Jong-il was all about expanding housing. So it was under his government that most apartments were built, 70s, 80s, and some of the more monumental ones. So it at that time, the Taedong River revitalization did not happen. This area, I think it was chosen for its historical value, having been the first residential area. And this is also right behind Kim Il-sung Square. So when you are facing Kim Il-sung Square, you see the square and the People's Study House, and behind it as a backdrop, you see the Ryugyong Hotel. So that kind of symbolic vision centered on the square, which is kind of an old notion. I think Kim Jong-il was kind of going for that. So I think that's part of it. Kim Jong-un is all about leisure. So there's work, and there is work under Kim Il-sung, and then housing under Kim Jong-il, and then with Kim Jong-un, it's about leisure. Well, at least that's the appearance of it. He's building parks, ski resorts, but also fancy apartments where the elites can enjoy their life. But it's not happening in the central area. You're right. It's happening more on the eastern part of Pyongyang, and further north. Yes, that is something that I will have to explore further. It's a fascinating pattern here, though. It's a fascinating pattern.
Thank you, Professor Kim, for the wonderful lecture. I had a question about some names, for example, names of objects, and the pairing of a native Korean name with a loan word like the Cholima traktoru
Yes,
or
traktoru.
otobai. I was wondering how you view this phenomenon, and
Yeah.
especially during your last visit to North Korea, have you encountered usage of loanwords from English or other languages?
Yeah. You know, loan words are quite common in the 50s and 60s in North Korea. So, taraktoru, I would imagine it's not purely English. So English loan words were not used. English loan words are not used. So these are loan words from the Soviet Union and East Germany and Eastern Europe. So there is a very diverse loan words happening in North Korea, but not English. They're not English. Loan words begin to fade in the 1970s, beginning with the Juche period in 1972. And then by the late 1970s and 80s, loan words are hardly used. But this period, 50s and 60s, oh, you see some bizarre words that I would have a very hard time immediately getting the meaning. So they use the word panel, panel. They just write it as panel, which today would seem impossible in North Korea, but in the 50s and 60s, it was quite common. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. I just want to remind the audience that our next colloquium talk is on December 7th by Professor Chung-Jun Lee, Associate Professor of Theory of History and Art and Design from RISDs. So please join us for our next talk. And please join me for thanking Professor Cheehyung Kim.
Thank you so much, guys. And I want to thank Semi and Evan and Youngju for making this visit so wonderful. You guys are just so amazing at planning and organizing. Thank you. And thanks for coming.